When I slammed the certified letter onto Uncle Theodore's mahogany desk at his estate reading, watching his smug expression crumble as he read the legal document that would destroy everything he thought he knew about our family's fortune, I finally understood what true justice felt like. "Congratulations, Uncle Ted," I said, my voice steady despite the years of humiliation he'd put me through, "on discovering that Grandpa's trust fund had very different ideas about gratitude than you did." The room fell silent as my cousins Brandon and Melissa stopped their celebration, their champagne glasses frozen halfway to their lips, while the family attorney's face went pale as he realized the massive legal oversight that was about to unravel a $50 million inheritance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this family nightmare began, because the truth about Uncle Theodore's manipulation and Grandpa's real intentions goes so much deeper than anyone could have imagined. My name is Catherine Elizabeth Morrison, and 6 months ago I thought I understood exactly where I stood in my family's complicated hierarchy of wealth and favoritism. I was the disappointing granddaughter, the one who'd chosen teaching over business, compassion over profit, and independence over the family's suffocating expectations. At 28, I was living in a modest apartment in Portland, Oregon, teaching 5th grade at Lincoln Elementary School, and perfectly content with my middle-class existence, far from the toxic dynamics of the Morrison family empire. The Morrisons had built their fortune in real estate development across the Pacific Northwest, starting with my great-grandfather's lumber mill in the 1920s and evolving into Morrison Holdings, a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate that owned shopping centers, office complexes, and residential developments from Seattle to San Francisco. My grandfather, William Harrison Morrison, had been the visionary who transformed the family business from regional lumber into a real estate empire, accumulating vast wealth that he'd always promised would benefit future generations who honored the family legacy. I'd grown up hearing stories about Grandpa William's business acumen, his charitable foundations, and his deep belief that wealth carried responsibility to help others. He died when I was 15, but I remembered him as a kind man who encouraged my love of reading, supported my academic achievements, and seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts about social justice and education reform. Unlike the rest of the family, he never made me feel inferior for preferring books to board meetings or for dreaming of making a difference through teaching rather than real estate development. Uncle Theodore, my father's older brother, had inherited control of Morrison Holdings when Grandpa William passed away. Theodore was everything I'd come to despise about inherited wealth: arrogant, entitled, and convinced that money made him inherently superior to people who worked for living wages. At 62, he lived in a sprawling estate in Lake Oswego, collected vintage cars, and treated service workers like personal servants. His children, my cousins Brandon and Melissa, had inherited his worst traits without any of his business intelligence, spending their trust fund allowances on luxury cars, designer clothes, and endless vacations, while contributing nothing meaningful to the family business or society. My relationship with Uncle Theodore had deteriorated completely during my college years at Portland State University, where I'd majored in elementary education with a minor in social work. He'd been furious when I'd turned down his offer to join Morrison Holdings after graduation, viewing my choice to become a teacher as a personal insult to the family's business legacy. "You're throwing away everything your grandfather built," he'd said during one particularly heated family dinner. "Teaching is a noble hobby, Catherine, but it's not a career for someone with your advantages and responsibilities." I'd tried to explain that Grandpa William had always encouraged me to follow my passion for education, that he'd spoken frequently about the importance of giving back to the community, and that teaching felt like the most meaningful way I could honor his memory. But Uncle Theodore had dismissed these arguments as naive idealism, insisting that my role was to contribute to the family business, not pursue what he called feel-good careers that don't generate wealth. The final break had come 3 years ago during Thanksgiving dinner at Theodore's estate, when he'd announced that Brandon would be taking over the company's educational foundation, a charitable organization that provided scholarships to underprivileged students. I'd spent years volunteering with similar programs and had proposed several initiatives to expand the foundation's impact, but Theodore had ignored my suggestions, while giving Brandon, who'd never shown interest in education or charity work, control over the organization I'd hoped to lead. Maybe if you'd shown more appreciation for the opportunities this family has given you, Theodore had said when I'd questioned his decision. Instead of constantly criticizing our business practices and rejecting everything we've worked to build, you'd be in a position to contribute meaningfully to the foundation. The accusation of ingratitude had stung because it was so fundamentally unfair. I'd never criticized the family's success or rejected their values out of spite. I'd simply chosen a different path, one that aligned with my personal beliefs about service and social responsibility. After that dinner, I'd made the decision to distance myself from the Morrison family dynamics entirely. I stopped attending family gatherings, declined invitations to Theodore's elaborate parties, and focused on building a life that felt authentic and meaningful. I loved my job at Lincoln Elementary, where I worked with students from diverse backgrounds, many of whom reminded me of the scholarship recipients Grandpa William had always been passionate about supporting. My apartment was small but comfortable. My salary was modest but sufficient. And my relationships were based on genuine connection rather than financial advantage. The first indication that something significant was happening with the family came on a rainy Tuesday morning in early November, when I received a formal letter from Blackstone Morrison and Associates, the law firm that had handled the Morrison family's legal affairs for decades. The envelope was thick and official, addressed to Ms. Catherine Elizabeth Morrison in the formal script that suggested important business correspondence. Inside was a letter from senior partner James Blackstone, requesting my presence at the reading of Uncle Theodore's will, scheduled for the following Friday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The letter was brief and professional, providing no details about Theodore's death or the circumstances that had led to this sudden legal proceeding. I realized with shock that I hadn't even known Uncle Theodore was ill, let alone that he'd passed away. Our family estrangement had been so complete that no one had informed me of his death. I called my mother, Patricia Morrison, who'd maintained minimal contact with Theodore's side of the family since my father's death 5 years earlier. She was as surprised as I was to learn about Theodore's passing and seemed genuinely puzzled about why I'd been included in the will reading. "Honey, you haven't spoken to Theodore in years," she said over the phone. "I can't imagine why his attorney would want you there. Maybe it's just a formality, because you're a family member." The law offices of Blackstone Morrison and Associates occupied an entire floor of a gleaming downtown Portland high-rise, with panoramic views of the Willamette River and Mount Hood. The reception area was decorated with expensive artwork and polished hardwood furniture that screamed old money and established power. I felt distinctly out of place in my teaching clothes, a simple black dress and cardigan that I'd considered appropriate for a legal proceeding, but which looked modest and understated compared to the designer outfits worn by the other family members who'd already assembled. Brandon Morrison, now 31, had inherited his father's arrogance along with his expensive taste in clothing. He wore a tailored Italian suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary, and carried himself with the entitled swagger of someone who'd never questioned his right to inherited wealth. His wife, Jennifer, a former beauty queen who'd married into the family for obvious financial reasons, sat beside him wearing jewelry that could have funded my classroom supplies for several years.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Melissa Morrison Chen, 29, had married into tech money through her husband David Chen, whose family owned a successful software company in Silicon Valley. She'd always been the more intelligent of Theodore's children, but her intelligence was focused entirely on maintaining her luxurious lifestyle and social status. She greeted me with the kind of polite coolness that suggested she viewed my presence as an unwelcome reminder of the family obligations she preferred to ignore. James Blackstone entered the conference room at exactly 2 o'clock, carrying a thick legal portfolio that contained what I assumed were the documents that would formalize the distribution of Uncle Theodore's substantial estate. Blackstone was in his 70s, with silver hair and the kind of gravitas that came from decades of handling the legal affairs of wealthy families. He'd known the Morrisons for over 40 years, and had personally drafted many of the documents that had structured the family's business empire. "Thank you all for being here during this difficult time," Blackstone began, his voice carrying the formal tone appropriate for such proceedings. Theodore Morrison was a complex man who built substantially upon the foundation his father established, and his will reflects his careful consideration of how his wealth should be distributed among family members and charitable organizations. He opened the portfolio and withdrew several documents, arranging them carefully on the polished conference table. Before we begin with the specific bequests, I want to note that Theodore updated his will significantly over the past several years, making several important changes that reflect his evolving perspective on family relationships and business succession. Brandon leaned forward eagerly, clearly anticipating that the bulk of Theodore's estate would pass to him as the eldest son and presumed heir to Morrison Holdings. Melissa maintained her composed expression, but I could see the calculation in her eyes as she considered what portion of the inheritance might be designated for her. Jennifer looked bored, probably assuming that her husband's inheritance would fund even more elaborate shopping trips and luxury vacations. I sat quietly, genuinely curious about why I'd been included in this proceeding, but expecting nothing more than a token bequest, or perhaps some family heirloom with sentimental value. The idea that Theodore would leave me anything substantial seemed impossible, given our years of estrangement and his frequent criticisms of my life choices. To my son Brandon Morrison, Blackstone read from the will, I leave the sum of $2 million, along with my collection of vintage automobiles and my membership in the Riverside Country Club. I trust that he will use these resources to continue building upon the Morrison legacy in whatever capacity he deems appropriate. Brandon's face showed confusion rather than satisfaction. $2 million was substantial by any normal measure, but it represented a tiny fraction of Theodore's wealth, which had been estimated at over $50 million. The vintage car collection and country club membership were nice additions, but Brandon had clearly expected to inherit the family business and the bulk of the estate. To my daughter Melissa Morrison Chen, Blackstone continued, I leave the sum of $2 million, along with my art collection and my condominium in Maui. I trust that she will appreciate these gifts and remember the importance of family loyalty and gratitude. Melissa's reaction was more controlled than her brother's, but I could see the same confusion and disappointment in her expression. She'd received the same monetary bequest as Brandon, plus valuable additions, but nothing approaching the inheritance she'd expected as Theodore's daughter, and someone who'd maintained a relationship with him throughout the family conflicts. To various charitable organizations, Blackstone read, including the Morrison Educational Foundation, the Pacific Northwest Land Conservancy, and the Children's Hospital of Portland, I leave a combined total of $10 million to be distributed according to the specifications outlined in the attached documentation. The charitable bequests were generous and reflected Theodore's awareness of his social responsibilities, but they still left the majority of his estate unaccounted for. I found myself doing mental arithmetic, realizing that the bequests announced so far totaled only $14 million out of an estimated $50 million estate. The remainder of my estate, Blackstone said, his voice taking on a more formal tone, including my controlling interest in Morrison Holdings, my primary residence and grounds, my investment portfolios, and all other assets not specifically designated above, I leave to my niece, Catherine Elizabeth Morrison. The silence that followed was absolute and devastating. Brandon's mouth fell open in shock, while Melissa sat frozen, apparently unable to process what she'd just heard. Jennifer looked around the room in confusion, clearly trying to understand how someone she'd barely acknowledged could have inherited the family fortune she'd expected to help manage. I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience, unable to comprehend that Uncle Theodore, who'd spent years criticizing my choices and questioning my gratitude, had left me the bulk of his estate. The controlling interest in Morrison Holdings alone was worth tens of millions of dollars, and his primary residence was a spectacular lakefront property that had been featured in architectural magazines. There must be some mistake, Brandon said, finding his voice first. Dad always said Catherine was ungrateful, that she'd rejected the family and didn't deserve to benefit from our success. Why would he leave her everything? Blackstone consulted his documents before responding. Your father's will includes a detailed explanation of his reasoning, which I'm authorized to read if the family wishes to hear it. Theodore spent considerable time crafting this document and wanted to ensure that his intentions were clearly understood. Yes, Melissa said sharply. We definitely want to hear his explanation. This makes no sense based on anything he ever said about Catherine. Blackstone turned to a different section of the will and began reading Theodore's own words. To my family and friends who may question my decision to designate Catherine as my primary heir, I want to explain the reasoning that led to this choice. Over the past several years, I've had the opportunity to observe how different family members have used the advantages they've been given, and I've come to understand that my father's values were better represented by Catherine's choices than by the path I initially encouraged. He paused, allowing the weight of these words to settle before continuing. Catherine chose a career in education, not because she was ungrateful for our family's success, but because she understood that wealth carries responsibility to serve others. She declined to join Morrison Holdings not out of rejection of our values, but because she wanted to contribute to society in ways that aligned with her grandfather's charitable spirit. She distanced herself from family gatherings not because she was selfish, but because she refused to compromise her integrity for financial gain. Brandon looked physically ill as he processed his father's assessment of the family dynamics. Melissa's composed facade was cracking, revealing anger and disbelief that her years of maintaining a relationship with Theodore had been less valued than my principal distance from the family conflicts. I have come to realize, Blackstone continued reading, that gratitude is not demonstrated through compliance or financial dependence, but through living according to principles that honor what previous generations worked to achieve. Catherine's commitment to education, her service to underprivileged children, and her refusal to compromise her values for money represent the kind of character that my father hoped to cultivate in his descendants. The explanation continued with Theodore's analysis of how his own children had used their inherited advantages. He acknowledged that while Brandon and Melissa were not bad people, they had developed attitudes of entitlement that prevented them from understanding the responsibility that came with significant wealth. He expressed concern that giving them control of the family fortune would result in its gradual dissipation through luxury spending rather than its growth, through wise investment and charitable contribution. Therefore, Blackstone read, I designate Catherine as my primary heir with the confidence that she will honor my father's legacy while using our family's resources to make meaningful contributions to society. I trust that her commitment to education and social justice will guide her in managing Morrison Holdings and continuing the charitable work that has always been central to our family's values. When Blackstone finished reading, the conference room fell silent again. I sat there trying to process not only the inheritance itself, but Theodore's complete reversal of his previous assessment of my character and choices. The uncle who'd criticized me for being ungrateful had apparently spent years reconsidering his understanding of gratitude and had ultimately decided that my independence and principles represented exactly the qualities he wanted to see in his heir. Brandon was the first to recover from the shock, and his response was predictably hostile. This is insane, he said, his voice rising. Dad was clearly not thinking straight when he wrote this will. Catherine hasn't been part of this family for years. She doesn't know anything about running a business, and she's made it clear that she doesn't care about our success or traditions. Brandon's right, Melissa added, her anger now clearly visible. Catherine rejected everything our family stands for. She chose to be poor when she could have been rich, and now suddenly she gets rewarded for that choice? This isn't what Dad really wanted. Someone must have influenced him to change his will. Their accusations stung, but I found myself thinking about Grandpa William and wondering what he would have thought about this inheritance. Theodore's will explicitly referenced his father's values and suggested that my choices had been more aligned with the family's original principles than the path his own children had taken. I understand this news is shocking and difficult to process, Blackstone said diplomatically. Theodore anticipated that there might be concerns about his decision, which is why he included such detailed explanations in the will. He also wanted me to emphasize that his bequests to Brandon and Melissa were intended to provide financial security, while encouraging them to develop the kind of character that would make them worthy of greater responsibility in the future. What about contesting the will? Jennifer asked, speaking for the first time since the reading began. If Theodore wasn't thinking clearly, or if someone influenced him inappropriately, we have legal options, right? Blackstone's expression suggested he'd expected this question. You certainly have the right to contest the will if you believe there are grounds for doing so. However, I should inform you that Theodore was very concerned about this possibility and took extensive steps to ensure that his mental competency and decision-making process were thoroughly documented. He underwent psychiatric evaluation, provided detailed interviews about his reasoning, and created a substantial record of his evolving perspective on family relationships. He opened another folder and withdrew several additional documents. Theodore also established a series of trust funds that would be activated in the event of legal challenges to his will. If any family member contests this inheritance, substantial portions of the estate would be immediately donated to charity, significantly reducing the total amount available for distribution among heirs. This revelation added another layer of complexity to the situation. Theodore had not only surprised everyone with his choice of primary heir, but he'd also created financial disincentives for legal challenges to his decision. He'd apparently spent considerable time and legal expertise crafting a will that would be extremely difficult to overturn and expensive to contest. As the implications of the inheritance began to settle in my mind, I realized that Uncle Theodore had given me something far more complicated than money. He'd made me responsible for a business empire I'd never wanted to run, a family legacy I'd deliberately distanced myself from, and relationships with cousins, who now viewed me as the person who'd stolen their rightful inheritance. But he'd also given me the resources to make the kind of impact I'd always dreamed of achieving through education and social justice work. Morrison Holdings controlled significant real estate assets that could be used for affordable housing development. The Morrison Educational Foundation could be expanded dramatically to provide scholarships and support programs for underprivileged students. The family's wealth could be transformed from a symbol of entitlement into a tool for meaningful social change. Walking out of that law office, carrying documents that made me one of the wealthiest people in Oregon, I felt overwhelmed by the responsibility Theodore had placed on my shoulders. But I also felt something I hadn't experienced in years: excitement about the possibility of using my unexpected inheritance to honor Grandpa William's values, while creating the kind of positive impact I'd always wanted to make in the world. What I didn't know as I drove home to my modest apartment, trying to process the complete transformation of my life circumstances, was that this inheritance would reveal family secrets that went far deeper than Theodore's change of heart about my character. There were documents in the Morrison family files that would explain not only why Theodore had chosen me as his heir, but why my grandfather had always seemed to understand and support my values in ways that the rest of the family never had. The real story behind my inheritance was just beginning, and the next few weeks would uncover truths about the Morrison family legacy that would shock everyone who thought they understood our history. Theodore's will had been surprising, but it was nothing compared to what I was about to discover about Grandpa William's original intentions for the family fortune and the secret trust fund that had been waiting for decades to fulfill his true vision for the Morrison legacy. The first thing I did after inheriting Uncle Theodore's estate was absolutely nothing. For 3 days, I continued teaching my 5th grade class at Lincoln Elementary, grading spelling tests and helping students with their multiplication tables, as if my entire world hadn't been turned upside down by a $50 million inheritance. The normalcy of my classroom routine provided a comforting anchor, while my mind struggled to process the magnitude of what had happened. My students noticed something was different, though. During Wednesday morning reading circle, 8-year-old Marcus Williams looked up from his book and asked, "Miss Morrison, are you okay? You seem really far away today." I assured him I was fine, but the truth was that I felt like I was living in someone else's life, trying to reconcile my identity as an elementary school teacher with my new reality as the heir to a business empire. The practical implications of the inheritance began hitting me Thursday morning when my phone started ringing before 6 o'clock. The first call was from Patricia Hendricks, the head of human resources at Morrison Holdings, requesting an urgent meeting to discuss the transition of leadership responsibilities. The second was from Martin Cruz, Theodore's personal financial advisor, wanting to schedule a comprehensive review of the investment portfolios I'd inherited. The third was from Rebecca Walsh, the executive director of the Morrison Educational Foundation, asking about my plans for the charitable organization that now fell under my control. Each conversation felt surreal. These were accomplished professionals who had worked with Theodore for years, and they were now looking to me for guidance about business decisions I wasn't qualified to make. Patricia Hendricks spoke about board meetings and quarterly reports, as if I understood the intricate workings of a multi-million-dollar corporation. Martin Cruz mentioned hedge funds and municipal bonds like I was familiar with complex investment strategies. Rebecca Walsh assumed I had opinions about scholarship criteria and educational grant distributions. I scheduled meetings with all of them for the following week, knowing I needed to understand the scope of my new responsibilities before making any major decisions. But first, I wanted to visit Theodore's estate and try to understand what had motivated his surprising change of heart about my character and worthiness as an heir. Theodore's house was everything I remembered from childhood visits, but somehow more imposing when viewed through the lens of ownership rather than family obligation. The Georgian colonial mansion sat on 12 acres of meticulously landscaped grounds overlooking Lake Oswego, with mature oak trees, formal gardens, and a private dock where Theodore had kept his collection of vintage boats. The house itself was over 8,000 square feet, with 6 bedrooms, 7 bathrooms, a library, a wine cellar, and a 3-car garage that housed the classic automobile collection I'd also inherited. Standing in the grand foyer with its marble floors and crystal chandelier, I felt overwhelmed by the contrast between this opulent environment and my modest apartment across town. Everything about the house spoke of wealth and privilege, from the imported Italian tiles to the custom millwork to the original artwork that decorated every room. This was the lifestyle Theodore had wanted me to embrace, the world of luxury and status that I'd rejected in favor of teaching and public service. But as I explored the house more thoroughly, I began noticing details that suggested Theodore's priorities had evolved significantly in recent years. His home office, which I remembered as a shrine to business achievement, decorated with awards and photographs of successful real estate developments, had been transformed into something that looked more like a research center, focused on social justice and educational reform. The bookshelves that had once held business journals and investment guides were now filled with texts on poverty alleviation, educational psychology, and community development. His desk was covered with research papers about income inequality, reports from various charitable organizations, and detailed analyses of educational programs in underserved communities. The walls displayed photographs of scholarship recipients from the Morrison Educational Foundation, rather than pictures of Theodore with wealthy business associates. Most surprising was a framed article from the Portland Tribune, featuring my work with the literacy program at Lincoln Elementary. The article had been published 2 years ago, highlighting innovative teaching methods I'd developed to help struggling readers. I'd never known that Theodore had seen the article, let alone thought it worthy of framing and displaying in his office. Seeing it there, surrounded by evidence of his growing interest in educational reform, began to explain his changing perspective on my career choices. In the desk drawers, I found additional evidence of Theodore's transformation. There were handwritten notes analyzing the effectiveness of various educational charities, calculations about how Morrison Holdings properties could be repurposed for affordable housing, and detailed plans for expanding the Morrison Educational Foundation's impact. One folder contained correspondence with education policy experts, social workers, and community organizers, suggesting that Theodore had been actively seeking guidance about how to use his wealth for meaningful social change. The most revealing discovery was a leather-bound journal that Theodore had apparently kept during the last 3 years of his life. The entries chronicled his growing dissatisfaction with Brandon and Melissa's attitudes toward inherited wealth, his increasing respect for my commitment to public service, and his evolving understanding of what it meant to honor his father's legacy. One entry from 18 months before his death particularly stood out. Watched Catherine's interview on the local news about her summer reading program for low-income students. She spoke with such passion about giving children opportunities to discover the joy of learning, regardless of their family's financial situation. Realized that she embodies everything Dad always said about using privilege to lift others up. Brandon and Melissa see wealth as an entitlement. Catherine sees education as a responsibility. Maybe I've been wrong about who truly understands gratitude. Reading Theodore's private thoughts about my work and character felt strange and emotional. For years, I'd believed he viewed my career choice as a personal rejection of family values. But his journal revealed someone who had been quietly observing my commitment to education and gradually recognizing that my path aligned with principles he'd come to value more than business success. Another entry, written just 6 months before his death, provided even more insight into his decision-making process. Met with James Blackstone today to discuss changing my will. Brandon asked me for another advance on his inheritance last week to fund some ridiculous sports car purchase. Melissa spent $30,000 on a jewelry shopping trip and posted photos on social media like it was an accomplishment. Meanwhile, Catherine organized a fundraiser for her school's breakfast program and raised enough money to feed hungry kids for an entire semester. She didn't ask our family for a single dollar, just worked with her community to solve a real problem. Dad would be proud of her and ashamed of what I've allowed Brandon and Melissa to become. The journal entries continued with Theodore's analysis of how different family members had responded to privilege and responsibility. He wrote extensively about his growing belief that inherited wealth without character was destructive rather than beneficial, and his conviction that the Morrison family fortune should be entrusted to someone who would use it wisely rather than selfishly. But the most shocking discovery came when I found a hidden compartment in Theodore's desk, accessible only through a combination lock that opened when I entered Grandpa William's birth year. Inside the compartment was a manila folder labeled William Morrison Private Trust Confidential, and a handwritten note from Theodore addressed to me. Catherine, the note read, "If you're reading this, it means you've inherited my estate and are probably confused about my change of heart regarding your worthiness as an heir. The truth is that my father established a separate trust fund that I've been managing since his death, waiting for the right family member to claim it. This trust was created specifically for a descendant who demonstrated the values Dad most cared about: integrity, service to others, and genuine gratitude expressed through action rather than words. I believe you are that person, and the enclosed documents will explain why this inheritance was always meant to be yours." My hands trembled as I opened the folder and began reading documents that would completely reframe my understanding of the Morrison family history and my place within it. The first document was a legal trust agreement dated just 2 months before Grandpa William's death, establishing the William Morrison Legacy Trust, with assets worth over $20 million in 1995 values, which had grown substantially through careful investment over the intervening decades. According to the trust documentation, Grandpa William had become concerned during his final years that his wealth might corrupt future generations, rather than empowering them to make positive contributions to society. He'd watched wealthy families in his social circle produce entitled, irresponsible children who squandered inherited fortunes on luxury and status symbols, rather than using their advantages to help others. Determined to prevent this outcome in his own family, he'd created a secondary trust fund that would only be activated when a descendant demonstrated through their actions and choices that they truly understood the responsibility that came with significant wealth. The trust agreement outlined specific criteria for identifying the worthy heir. The chosen family member must demonstrate commitment to public service or charitable work, must show evidence of living modestly despite having access to wealth, must exhibit genuine concern for less fortunate people, and must display the kind of character that would use inherited resources wisely rather than selfishly. Most importantly, this person must choose integrity over financial gain, even when that choice resulted in family conflict or social disapproval. As I read these criteria, I realized they described my life choices with startling accuracy. My career in education was clearly public service. My modest lifestyle demonstrated that I wasn't motivated by material accumulation. My work with low-income students showed concern for the less fortunate. And my willingness to distance myself from family wealth rather than compromise my principles had apparently been exactly the kind of integrity Grandpa William wanted to see in his heir. The trust documents included detailed letters from Grandpa William explaining his reasoning and his hopes for how the fund would eventually be used. I have observed that people who inherit wealth without earning it often develop attitudes of entitlement that prevent them from understanding their obligations to society, he wrote. However, someone who chooses service over affluence, who willingly accepts lower income in order to help others, demonstrates the kind of character that can be trusted with significant resources. This trust is designed to find that person among my descendants and empower them to make the kind of positive impact that wealth should enable. The second major revelation was that Theodore had been testing potential heirs for over a decade, carefully observing how different family members responded to various opportunities and challenges. Brandon and Melissa had been given multiple chances to demonstrate wisdom and responsibility, but their choices had consistently prioritized personal pleasure over social contribution. They'd used their trust fund allowances for luxury purchases, shown little interest in the family's charitable work, and demonstrated the kind of entitlement that Grandpa William had feared would develop in his descendants. Theodore's journal entries revealed that he'd offered Brandon several opportunities to take on meaningful responsibility within Morrison Holdings, including leadership roles in community development projects and affordable housing initiatives. But Brandon had shown more interest in the prestige and financial benefits of these positions than in their potential for positive social impact. Similarly, Melissa had been invited to help expand the Morrison Educational Foundation's programs, but she'd approached this work as a networking opportunity rather than a genuine commitment to helping students. Meanwhile, Theodore had been quietly tracking my career and volunteer work, noting my dedication to educational equity, my success in developing programs for struggling students, and my consistent choice to prioritize social impact over personal financial gain. He'd apparently spoken with administrators at Lincoln Elementary, reviewed my performance evaluations, and even attended some of the community events where I'd spoken about educational reform, always from the back of the room where I wouldn't notice his presence. The most emotional discovery was a letter Grandpa William had written specifically for the heir who would eventually claim the trust fund. The letter was sealed and marked, to be opened only by the chosen Morrison descendant, and reading it felt like receiving a message from beyond the grave from the grandfather who'd always encouraged my dreams and supported my values. "My dear descendant," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means you have demonstrated the qualities I hope to see in someone entrusted with our family's wealth. You have chosen service over selfishness, integrity over advantage, and genuine gratitude over entitled consumption. These choices were not easy, and they likely resulted in criticism from family members who misunderstood your motivations. But your willingness to face that criticism rather than compromise your principles proves that you possess the character necessary to use wealth wisely." Grandpa William's letter continued with his vision for how the trust fund should be used. He wanted to see the Morrison family fortune transformed from a symbol of privilege into a tool for social justice. He envisioned affordable housing developments that would provide dignified homes for working families, educational programs that would give disadvantaged children opportunities to succeed, and community development initiatives that would strengthen neighborhoods and reduce inequality. "Wealth is not an end in itself," he wrote, "but a means to create opportunities for others. I have been blessed with success in business, but my greatest pride comes from knowing that our family's resources have helped build schools, support students, and strengthen communities. I trust that you will continue this work on a much larger scale, using both the Morrison Holdings assets and this additional trust fund to make the kind of impact that will honor our family's true legacy." The financial documents accompanying the letter revealed that the William Morrison Legacy Trust had grown to over $40 million through careful investment and compound growth over the past 15 years. Combined with the assets I'd inherited through Theodore's will, this meant I now controlled nearly $100 million in resources that could be used for the kind of social impact work Grandpa William had envisioned. But the trust fund came with specific conditions that reflected Grandpa William's concerns about the corrupting influence of inherited wealth. I would receive a modest annual stipend for personal expenses, but the bulk of the fund had to be used for charitable purposes, educational initiatives, or community development projects. The trust included oversight mechanisms to ensure the money was used responsibly, and it established accountability measures that would prevent the kind of wasteful spending that had characterized Brandon and Melissa's relationship with inherited wealth. Reading through these documents in Theodore's study, surrounded by evidence of his transformation from a profit-focused businessman into someone genuinely committed to social justice, I began to understand the true scope of the responsibility I'd inherited. This wasn't just about managing a business empire or continuing the Morrison family legacy. It was about fulfilling Grandpa William's vision for using wealth as a force for positive change in the world. The final document in the hidden folder was a detailed plan Theodore had developed for transitioning control of Morrison Holdings and the various trust funds to me. He'd anticipated that I would feel overwhelmed by the sudden responsibility and had created a comprehensive support system to help me learn the business aspects of wealth management, while focusing on the social impact initiatives that aligned with my values and expertise. The plan included recommendations for key personnel who could help manage the day-to-day operations of Morrison Holdings, while I focused on strategic decisions about how to use the company's resources for community benefit. Theodore had identified executives within the organization who shared his evolved perspective on corporate responsibility, and who could be trusted to implement policies that prioritize social impact alongside financial performance. He'd also established relationships with experts in affordable housing development, educational reform, and community organizing, who could provide guidance about how to use the Morrison family resources most effectively. The plan included detailed proposals for converting some of Morrison Holdings' commercial properties into affordable housing, expanding the Educational Foundation's programs, and launching new initiatives focused on economic development in underserved communities. Most importantly, Theodore's plan acknowledged that I would need time to develop the business skills necessary to manage such a large organization effectively. He'd arranged for experienced mentors who could teach me about real estate investment, financial management, and corporate governance, while respecting my commitment to using these tools for social benefit rather than pure profit maximization. As I finished reading through all the documents in the hidden folder, I felt a profound sense of connection to Grandpa William's values and Theodore's eventual understanding of what the Morrison family legacy should represent. The inheritance that had initially seemed like an overwhelming burden now felt like an opportunity to honor the principles that had guided my career in education, while making a much larger impact than I'd ever thought possible. But I also realized that claiming this inheritance and accepting the responsibility it entailed would require confronting the family members who felt betrayed by Theodore's decision. Brandon and Melissa were undoubtedly planning to contest the will, and they would be furious to discover that their disinheritance had been orchestrated not by Theodore's last-minute change of heart, but by a trust fund their grandfather had established specifically to bypass them in favor of someone who demonstrated genuine character and commitment to social justice. The next morning, I called James Blackstone to discuss the additional trust fund and its implications for the inheritance dispute I knew was coming. Blackstone had been expecting my call and seemed relieved that I'd discovered the hidden documents on my own, rather than requiring him to explain the complex legal arrangement that had been kept secret for over 15 years. Your grandfather was very concerned about keeping the trust fund confidential until the right heir emerged, Blackstone explained during our phone conversation. He worried that if family members knew about the additional money and the criteria for claiming it, they might try to manipulate their behavior to appear worthy rather than demonstrating genuine character through their natural choices and actions. Blackstone went on to explain that Theodore had been the only family member who knew about the trust fund, and even he hadn't been told the specific criteria for identifying the chosen heir until just 3 years before his death. Grandpa William had wanted to ensure that potential heirs would reveal their true values through years of independent choices, rather than through strategic behavior designed to claim an inheritance. Theodore struggled with the responsibility for several years, Blackstone continued. He genuinely loved Brandon and Melissa, and hoped they would eventually demonstrate the kind of character your grandfather was looking for. But as they got older, and their attitudes toward wealth became more entitled, he realized they were unlikely to develop the wisdom and sense of responsibility that the trust fund required. The conversation with Blackstone clarified several legal aspects of my situation that would be crucial for dealing with the inevitable family conflict. The William Morrison Legacy Trust was completely separate from Theodore's estate, which meant that even if Brandon and Melissa successfully contested Theodore's will, they couldn't touch the $40 million that Grandpa William had designated for a worthy heir. The trust had its own legal documentation, its own investment management, and its own clearly defined criteria for distribution. Moreover, the trust included provisions that protected it from family disputes or legal challenges. Grandpa William had anticipated that his decision to bypass traditional inheritance patterns might create conflict, so he'd structured the trust in ways that made it legally bulletproof, while ensuring that the money would be used for its intended purposes, regardless of family politics. Your grandfather was a very wise man, Blackstone said as our conversation concluded. He understood that wealth without character is ultimately destructive, both for individuals and for society. He created this trust because he believed that someone in his family would eventually demonstrate the values he cared about most. Theodore's will simply confirmed what the trust had already established. You were always going to inherit the resources to carry out your grandfather's vision. Theodore's estate just added to those resources and provided the business infrastructure to implement large-scale social impact projects. That afternoon, I made the decision that would define the next phase of my life. I submitted my resignation letter to Lincoln Elementary School, effective at the end of the current semester, and began the process of transitioning into my role as the steward of the Morrison family fortune. The decision was emotionally difficult because I loved teaching and felt deep connections to my students and colleagues, but I realized that the inheritance gave me the opportunity to impact thousands of students rather than just the 30 children in my classroom each year. My principal, Janet Rodriguez, was shocked by my resignation but supportive of my decision when I explained the situation. Catherine, you've always talked about wanting to reform educational funding and create more opportunities for disadvantaged students, she said. Now you have the resources to actually do that on a scale that could change lives across the entire region. You'd be crazy not to take this opportunity. Some of my colleagues were less understanding, viewing my inheritance as abandoning the public education system for personal wealth. But I tried to explain that my goal was to use the Morrison family resources to strengthen public education, rather than replacing it with private alternatives. I wanted to fund teacher training programs, provide technology resources for underserved schools, and create scholarship opportunities that would help more students succeed academically. The real test of my commitment to Grandpa William's vision came the following week, when I met with Brandon and Melissa to discuss their plans for contesting Theodore's will. They'd requested the meeting through their attorney, apparently hoping to negotiate some kind of settlement that would give them access to more of Theodore's estate than the $2 million each they'd received in his will. We met at the Morrison Holdings headquarters, a gleaming office building in downtown Portland that I now technically owned but had never visited before. The conference room where we gathered had panoramic views of the city and the Cascade Mountains, reminding me of the scope of the business empire I'd inherited and the responsibilities that came with controlling such significant resources. Brandon arrived with his attorney, a sharp-looking woman named Sarah Patterson who specialized in inheritance disputes. Melissa brought her husband David Chen, whose tech industry background apparently made him the family's expert on financial strategy. They all looked like they were preparing for a hostile business negotiation, rather than a family discussion about Theodore's final wishes. Catherine, Brandon began, his tone carefully controlled but unmistakably angry. We think there's been a serious mistake with Dad's will. He was clearly not thinking clearly during his final years, and someone must have influenced him to make decisions that don't reflect his true intentions or his understanding of our family dynamics. Sarah Patterson supported Brandon's position with legal arguments about undue influence and diminished capacity, suggesting that Theodore's dramatic change in inheritance plans indicated mental instability or manipulation by outside parties. She implied that my estrangement from the family made me a suspicious beneficiary, and that Theodore's decision to leave me the bulk of his estate was evidence of impaired judgment. Melissa took a different approach, appealing to family loyalty and suggesting that we could work together to manage the Morrison Holdings empire, if I would agree to redistribute Theodore's estate more equitably among his children and nieces. We're family, she said, and families should take care of each other. Dad was angry about some things, but he wouldn't have wanted his children to be left with so little, while his niece inherited everything. I listened to their arguments and appeals, understanding their perspective, while also recognizing that they had no idea about the deeper family history that had led to this inheritance distribution. They still believed Theodore's will represented a last-minute change of heart, rather than the culmination of a plan that had been developing for over 15 years. When they finished presenting their case, I opened the folder containing documents from the William Morrison Legacy Trust and placed copies in front of each of them. Before we discuss contesting Theodore's will, I said, I think you should understand the full scope of what Grandpa William intended for our family's wealth. The silence that followed as they read through the trust documents was even more profound than the quiet that had followed Theodore's will reading. Brandon's face went through a series of expressions as he processed the realization that his disinheritance hadn't been a recent development, but the result of decades of observation and evaluation. Melissa looked physically ill as she understood that the grandfather she'd thought loved her equally had actually been testing her character and found it wanting. David Chen was the first to speak, his business background helping him grasp the financial implications quickly. "This trust fund has been active for 15 years?" he asked. "Your grandfather had been planning this inheritance pattern since before Brandon and Melissa were even adults?" I confirmed that the trust had been established in 1995 and that Theodore had been managing it according to Grandpa Williams' instructions, waiting for a family member to demonstrate the character traits outlined in the trust agreement. I explained that my inheritance of Theodore's estate was secondary to the trust fund that had always been intended for someone who showed genuine commitment to social justice and public service. "This changes everything about the legal situation," Sarah Patterson admitted reluctantly. "The trust fund is completely separate from Theodore's estate, so even if we successfully contest his will, it wouldn't affect the bulk of your inheritance. And the criteria for claiming the trust are clearly documented and objectively verifiable through your career choices and volunteer work." Brandon looked devastated as he processed the implications. "So Grandpa never really intended for me to inherit the family business," he said quietly. "He was testing us the whole time, and I failed the test without even knowing I was being evaluated." The revelation seemed to trigger genuine self-reflection, rather than just anger about missed financial opportunities. Brandon began questioning his spending habits, his attitudes toward inherited wealth, and his lack of involvement in charitable work. For the first time in our adult relationship, he seemed to be considering whether his lifestyle and values were consistent with the family principles he'd claimed to represent. Melissa's reaction was more complex, combining hurt feelings with analytical assessment of how the trust fund would affect her family's financial future. "I understand why Grandpa set up these criteria," she said finally, "but it hurts to realize that he didn't think I was capable of using wealth responsibly. I may not have chosen public service as a career, but I've tried to be a good person and a responsible family member." I felt sympathy for both of my cousins as they struggled with the realization that their grandfather had judged their characters and found them insufficiently committed to social responsibility. But I also recognized that Grandpa Williams' assessment had been accurate. Neither Brandon nor Melissa had shown genuine interest in using their inherited advantages to help others or address social problems. They'd focused on maintaining comfortable lifestyles rather than considering how their wealth could contribute to positive change in the world. The meeting concluded with Brandon and Melissa agreeing to abandon their plans to contest Theodore's will, recognizing that the legal challenge would be expensive, unlikely to succeed, and ultimately pointless, given that the bulk of my inheritance came from the trust fund rather than Theodore's estate. But more importantly, they seemed to be genuinely grappling with questions about how they wanted to use their lives and resources going forward. "Maybe this is an opportunity for all of us to reconsider what it means to honor Grandpa's legacy," Melissa said as we prepared to leave the conference room. "You've inherited the responsibility for the big picture, but Brandon and I still have resources and opportunities to make positive contributions. Maybe we can find ways to support the work you're planning rather than competing with it." Walking out of Morrison Holdings that day, carrying the legal documents that confirmed my control over nearly $100 million in assets, I felt the weight of Grandpa Williams' expectations and the magnitude of the opportunity he'd created. The inheritance was more than financial resources. It was a mandate to transform the Morrison family legacy from a symbol of privilege into a force for social justice and educational equity. But I also felt something I hadn't expected: hope that this revelation might actually bring our fractured family back together around shared values, rather than dividing us through wealth distribution conflicts. Brandon and Melissa had been shocked to discover their grandfather's true intentions, but they seemed genuinely interested in understanding how they could align their lives with principles they'd previously ignored. The real work of honoring Grandpa Williams' vision was just beginning, and I knew it would require not only managing business operations and charitable initiatives, but also helping my family members rediscover the values that had motivated our grandfather to build his fortune in the first place. The inheritance had chosen me as the primary steward of the Morrison family resources, but its ultimate success would depend on whether all of us could learn to use our advantages in service of something larger than our own comfort and status. 6 months after discovering Grandpa Williams' trust fund, I stood in the renovated community center that had once been a struggling strip mall in East Portland, watching 37 formerly homeless families receive keys to their new affordable housing units. The Morrison Heights development represented everything Grandpa William had envisioned when he created his legacy trust: dignified housing for working families, integrated community services, and economic opportunities that strengthened neighborhoods rather than displacing existing residents. The transformation had been extraordinary. Working with architect Elena Vasquez and community organizer Jerome Washington, we'd converted the abandoned retail space into a mixed-use development that included 64 affordable apartments, a childcare center, a health clinic, and space for small businesses owned by residents. The project had cost $8 million from the trust fund, but it would house families for decades while generating enough rental income to fund similar developments across the region. Maria Santos, a single mother who worked as a nursing assistant at the nearby hospital, wiped away tears as she accepted the keys to her two-bedroom apartment. "I never thought I'd be able to afford a safe place for my kids," she told me. The revelation about Grandpa Williams' trust had initially devastated them, but it had also prompted genuine self-reflection about how they wanted to use their lives and resources going forward. Brandon had surprised everyone by requesting a role in the affordable housing projects, bringing his business administration background to the complex task of managing construction timelines, vendor relationships, and regulatory compliance. His attention to detail and ability to coordinate multiple contractors had been crucial to completing Morrison Heights on schedule and within budget. More importantly, he developed genuine relationships with future residents during the development process, listening to their needs and incorporating their feedback into design decisions. "I spent years thinking success meant accumulating luxury items," Brandon told me during one of our weekly project meetings. "But watching these families get stable housing has taught me that real satisfaction comes from solving actual problems. Dad was right about me being entitled, but maybe it's not too late to become someone Grandpa would have been proud of." Melissa had channeled her organizational skills and social connections into fundraising for the Educational Foundation, hosting events that introduced wealthy Portland families to the realities of educational inequity while inspiring them to contribute time and resources to solutions. Her tech industry connections had been particularly valuable in securing donations of computer equipment and software licenses for schools that couldn't afford current technology. She'd also become passionate about financial literacy education, developing workshops that taught budgeting, saving, and investment principles to high school students from low-income families. Her own experience growing up with inherited wealth had given her unique insights into both the opportunities and the dangers of financial privilege, making her an effective educator about responsible money management. "I realized I'd been taking my advantages for granted without considering how to use them wisely," Melissa explained during a presentation to potential foundation donors. "These students are learning skills I never had to develop because money was always available. Teaching them financial responsibility has taught me about it too." The family transformation had extended beyond our immediate circle. Theodore's example of questioning inherited privilege and redirecting wealth toward social justice had inspired other wealthy families in Portland to examine their own philanthropic strategies. The Morrison Educational Foundation had become a model for effective charitable giving, demonstrating how significant resources could create systemic change rather than just providing temporary assistance. Dr. Angela Torres, the superintendent of Portland Public Schools, had become a close collaborator in developing programs that addressed educational inequity comprehensively. "What makes the Morrison Foundation unique," she told a gathering of education policymakers, "is their understanding that helping individual students succeed requires changing the systems that created educational disadvantages in the first place." The Foundation's teacher training programs had been particularly transformative, providing professional development opportunities that helped educators work more effectively with students from diverse cultural and economic backgrounds. We'd funded graduate degree programs for practicing teachers, created mentorship networks that connected experienced educators with newcomers to the profession, and supported research into innovative teaching methods that improved learning outcomes for all students. Lincoln Elementary, my former school, had become one of the Foundation's flagship demonstration sites. Principal Janet Rodriguez had worked with Foundation staff to implement comprehensive reforms that addressed not only academic instruction, but also social services, family engagement, and community partnerships. The school now offered after-school programs, adult education classes, and health services that strengthened the entire neighborhood while improving educational outcomes for students. "Catherine always talked about wanting to impact education policy," Janet told a reporter covering the Foundation's work. "Now she's actually changing how we think about school funding, teacher support, and community involvement." Her students are benefiting from programs that serve thousands of children across the region. But the most significant validation of our approach came from unexpected sources. James Morrison, Grandpa William's younger brother who'd moved to California decades ago, reached out after reading about the Foundation's work in a national education journal. Uncle James had maintained minimal contact with our family since Grandpa William's death, but he'd been quietly observing how different family members responded to inherited wealth. "Your grandfather would be extraordinarily proud of what you've accomplished," Uncle James told me during a phone conversation that reconnected us after years of distance. He always worried that the family fortune would corrupt future generations rather than empowering them to contribute positively to society. Your work proves that his trust fund succeeded in identifying someone who truly understood the responsibility that comes with significant resources. Uncle James revealed that he'd established his own charitable foundation in California focused on environmental conservation, inspired partly by Grandpa William's emphasis on using wealth for social benefit. He'd been waiting to see how the Portland branch of the family would handle inherited responsibility before reaching out to propose collaboration on projects that addressed both educational inequity and environmental sustainability. The conversation led to joint initiatives that combined the Morrison Educational Foundation's expertise in school-based programs with environmental education projects that taught students about renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, and climate change solutions. These programs not only expanded students' academic knowledge, but also provided hands-on experience with technologies and practices that could create future career opportunities in growing green industries. The environmental partnership also prompted deeper reflection about how Morrison Holdings real estate developments could model sustainable practices while creating affordable housing. Working with green building specialists, we'd incorporated solar panels, energy-efficient appliances, and water conservation systems into the Morrison Heights project, demonstrating that environmental responsibility and social justice could be advanced simultaneously. The success of these integrated approaches attracted attention from urban planners, policymakers, and foundation leaders across the country who wanted to understand how comprehensive community development could address multiple social challenges effectively. I found myself speaking at conferences, consulting with other wealthy families about responsible philanthropy, and serving on boards of organizations that promoted systemic approaches to social change. But the most meaningful recognition came from the students and families whose lives had been directly impacted by the programs we'd created. Sophia Santos, the little girl who'd thanked me for creating a real home, was now thriving in second grade at the on-site elementary school we'd built as part of Morrison Heights. Her mother, Maria, had been promoted to head nurse at the community health clinic, benefiting from the career development programs we'd created for residents. Marcus Williams, one of my former students from Lincoln Elementary, had received a Morrison Foundation scholarship to attend Portland State University, where he was studying education with plans to become a teacher in underserved communities. "Miss Morrison taught me that everyone deserves good schools," he told a foundation newsletter. "Now I want to help create those schools for kids like me." These individual success stories multiplied across hundreds of students and families who'd benefited from foundation programs, affordable housing developments, and community services funded through the Legacy Trust. Each success validated Grandpa William's belief that wealth could be transformed from a symbol of privilege into a tool for expanding opportunity and strengthening communities. The contrast with how Brandon and Melissa had previously used their inherited advantages was striking. Instead of luxury purchases and status symbols, they were now investing their time and resources in projects that created lasting positive change. Their transformation had been so complete that other family members who'd initially supported their efforts to contest Theodore's will had begun questioning their own priorities and seeking ways to contribute to the foundation's work. Jennifer, Brandon's wife, had initially been angry about the reduced inheritance that resulted from Theodore's will, but she'd gradually become involved in foundation fundraising events. Her background in marketing and event planning had proven valuable in organizing gatherings that educated potential donors about educational inequity, while inspiring them to support comprehensive solutions. David Chen, Melissa's husband, had used his technology expertise to develop software applications that helped nonprofit organizations track program effectiveness and measure social impact. His innovations had been adopted by other charitable foundations, improving their ability to evaluate which programs created meaningful change and which needed refinement or replacement. Even the extended family members who'd remained distant from our philanthropic work had begun recognizing the positive impact of using inherited wealth responsibly. Cousins who'd spent years focused on maintaining their own comfortable lifestyles were asking questions about how they could contribute to foundation initiatives or support community development projects in their own regions. The ripple effects extended beyond our family to influence how other wealthy Portland families approach charitable giving and community responsibility. The Morrison Foundation's comprehensive approach to addressing social challenges had inspired similar initiatives that tackled affordable housing, educational inequity, and community development through coordinated strategies rather than isolated programs. Mayor Rebecca Martinez had established a city task force on inclusive development that used Morrison Heights as a model for future projects that combined affordable housing with community services and economic opportunities. The Morrison family has shown that private wealth can be leveraged to address public challenges, she announced during a press conference about new affordable housing initiatives. Their approach proves that philanthropy can create systemic change rather than just providing temporary assistance. Dr. Sarah Kim, director of the Pacific Northwest Policy Institute, had begun researching the foundation's methods for a book about effective philanthropy that would be published by a major university press. What makes the Morrison Foundation remarkable, she explained during our interview for her research, is their understanding that social problems are interconnected and require comprehensive solutions that address root causes rather than just symptoms. The recognition was gratifying, but the real measure of success was the ongoing impact of programs that would continue creating opportunities for students and families long after the initial foundation investments. The affordable housing developments generated rental income that funded maintenance and improvements while providing stable homes for working families. The educational programs had trained teachers and administrators who would influence thousands of students throughout their careers. The community development initiatives had strengthened neighborhoods in ways that attracted additional investment and resources. Most importantly, the foundation had demonstrated that inherited wealth could be used to expand opportunity, rather than concentrating advantage among already privileged families. The trust fund that Grandpa William had created to find a worthy heir had succeeded in identifying someone committed to using resources for social benefit, but its ultimate success lay in inspiring others to examine their own relationship with wealth and privilege. Standing in my office at Morrison Holdings on a rainy December evening, reviewing reports about foundation programs and community development projects, I reflected on how completely my life had been transformed by discovering Uncle Theodore's true reasons for changing his will. The modest apartment where I'd lived as an elementary school teacher had been replaced by Theodore's estate, but I'd converted most of the mansion into meeting spaces and offices for foundation staff rather than using it as a private residence. The inheritance had provided resources beyond anything I'd imagined possible, but it had also required developing skills and taking on responsibilities that challenged me in ways my teaching career never had. Learning to manage multi-million-dollar budgets, coordinate complex construction projects, and navigate political relationships with city officials and community leaders had demanded growth that was both professionally demanding and personally fulfilling. But the most significant change was understanding how wealth could be used as a tool for justice, rather than a symbol of status. Grandpa William's trust fund had been designed to find someone who would use inherited resources wisely, and his criteria had identified character traits that proved essential for managing large-scale social impact projects effectively. The commitment to public service that had led me to choose teaching over business had prepared me to prioritize community benefit over personal gain when making decisions about foundation programs. The modest lifestyle I'd maintained despite having access to family wealth had taught me to distinguish between necessary expenses and luxury consumption, skills that proved crucial for managing foundation budgets efficiently. The concern for less fortunate people that had motivated my work with low-income students had provided the emotional foundation for understanding how inherited privilege could be used to expand opportunities for others. Most importantly, the willingness to choose integrity over financial advantage that had led me to distance myself from family wealth rather than compromise my principles had demonstrated the kind of character that could be trusted with significant resources and the responsibility they entailed. The phone rang, interrupting my reflection. It was Dr. Angela Torres, calling with news about the latest standardized test results from schools participating in foundation programs. Student achievement had improved significantly across all demographic groups, with particularly dramatic gains among students from low-income families who'd benefited from comprehensive support services. Catherine, these results are extraordinary, Dr. Torres said, her excitement evident in her voice. The schools working with Morrison Foundation programs are showing achievement gains that are 3 times the district average. More importantly, the gaps between different student populations are narrowing, which means we're actually addressing inequity rather than just raising overall scores. The data confirmed what we'd observed anecdotally in individual schools and classrooms. Comprehensive approaches that addressed not only academic instruction but also social services, family engagement, and community partnerships created learning environments where all students could succeed regardless of their background circumstances. As we discussed plans for expanding successful programs to additional schools, I thought about Grandpa William's vision for using wealth to create opportunities for others. The trust fund he'd established had grown into a comprehensive foundation that was changing lives across the region while demonstrating sustainable approaches to philanthropy that other wealthy families could adapt to their own community contexts. The window behind my desk looked out over downtown Portland, where lights were beginning to twinkle in office buildings and residential neighborhoods. Somewhere in those neighborhoods were students whose educational opportunities had been expanded by foundation programs, families whose lives had been stabilized by affordable housing developments, and communities whose economic prospects had been improved by thoughtful development projects. The inheritance that had begun with Uncle Theodore's surprising will reading had evolved into something far more significant than a family wealth transfer. It had become a demonstration of how inherited privilege could be transformed into a force for social justice, how family resources could be used to expand opportunity rather than concentrating advantage, and how individual character could influence the impact of significant wealth on community well-being. Brandon knocked on my office door, carrying the final reports from the Morrison Heights project that documented both the financial performance and social impact of our first major affordable housing development. The project had exceeded expectations in both measures, generating sufficient rental income to fund similar developments, while providing stable housing for families who'd previously been priced out of safe neighborhoods. The waiting list for Phase 2 is already at 200 families, Brandon reported. Elena thinks we can break ground on the next development by spring if the city approves our proposal for the Jade District site. His transformation from entitled heir to committed community developer had been remarkable, but it reflected genuine character growth rather than strategic behavior designed to impress family members. Melissa arrived a few minutes later with updates about the scholarship program that had become one of the Foundation's most successful initiatives. Over 400 students had received Morrison Foundation scholarships over the past 2 years, with retention rates and academic performance that exceeded national averages for first-generation college students. The mentorship component is making the biggest difference, Melissa explained. Students aren't just getting financial support. They're getting guidance from professionals who understand the challenges of navigating higher education without family experience to draw from. Her work with scholarship recipients had given her insights into educational inequity that informed foundation policies while providing personal fulfillment that luxury shopping had never delivered. As we reviewed foundation reports and planned future initiatives, I marveled at how discovering Grandpa William's trust had not only provided resources for social impact work, but had also reunited our family around shared values and meaningful goals. The wealth that could have divided us through inheritance disputes had instead brought us together through collaborative efforts to honor our grandfather's vision for using privilege responsibly. The evening concluded with a conference call from Uncle James in California, who wanted to discuss joint applications for federal grants that could fund even larger-scale educational and environmental initiatives. The connections between Morrison Foundation programs and California projects had created opportunities for policy influence that extended far beyond what either organization could achieve independently. Your grandfather always believed that wealth carried the obligation to strengthen society, Uncle James reminded us during the call. The work you're doing in Portland proves that his trust fund succeeded in finding someone who truly understood that responsibility. But more importantly, it shows that inherited wealth can be used to create the kind of positive change he always envisioned. Driving home through the December evening to the modest apartment I'd chosen to keep rather than moving into Theodore's mansion, I reflected on the year that had transformed my understanding of family, wealth, and social responsibility. The inheritance that had begun as a shocking surprise had evolved into the foundation for work that felt more meaningful than anything I'd ever imagined possible. The students I taught at Lincoln Elementary had inspired my commitment to educational equity, but the Morrison Foundation had provided resources to address those challenges systematically, rather than just supporting individual children. The modest lifestyle I'd maintained as a teacher had prepared me to manage inherited wealth wisely, focusing on social impact rather than personal luxury. The principles Grandpa William had valued had guided every decision about how to use family resources for community benefit. Most importantly, the trust fund that had been created to find a worthy heir had succeeded in identifying someone committed to using wealth as a tool for justice rather than a symbol of status. The inheritance had chosen me not because I was perfect, but because my choices had demonstrated the kind of character that could be trusted with significant resources and the responsibility they entailed. Uncle Theodore's decision to leave me his estate had initially seemed like a surprising change of heart about my worthiness as an heir. But discovering Grandpa William's trust had revealed that this inheritance was part of a longer family story about values, character, and the responsible use of privilege that had been developing for decades. The ungrateful granddaughter who'd rejected family wealth in favor of teaching had become the steward of a philanthropic legacy that was transforming lives across the region, while inspiring other wealthy families to examine their own relationship with inherited advantage. The trust fund that had waited 15 years for a worthy heir had found someone committed to using its resources for the kind of social change Grandpa William had always envisioned. The real measure of success wasn't the amount of money distributed or the number of programs created, but the sustainable impact of initiatives that would continue expanding opportunities for students and families long after the initial foundation investments. The affordable housing developments would provide stable homes for generations of working families. The educational programs would influence thousands of students through the teachers and administrators they'd trained. The community development projects would strengthen neighborhoods in ways that attracted additional resources and investment. Standing in my apartment that evening, looking at photos of scholarship recipients, affordable housing residents, and community partners whose lives had been touched by foundation programs, I understood that Grandpa William's trust had succeeded beyond his original vision. The inheritance had not only found a worthy heir committed to social justice, but had also demonstrated how inherited wealth could be transformed from a symbol of privilege into a force for expanding opportunity and strengthening communities. The trust fund had disagreed with Uncle Theodore's original assessment of my gratitude, recognizing that genuine appreciation for family advantages was demonstrated through service to others, rather than compliance with expectations. The inheritance that had once seemed like an overwhelming burden had become the foundation for work that honored both Grandpa William's values and my own commitment to using privilege responsibly. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as foundation programs expanded to serve more students and families, while demonstrating sustainable approaches to philanthropy that other organizations could adapt to their own contexts. But tonight, reviewing reports about lives changed and communities strengthened through thoughtful use of inherited resources, I felt profound gratitude for Grandpa William's wisdom in creating a trust that had transformed family wealth into a legacy of social justice that would continue growing for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.